What's the best ground type Pokemon? I want to know. You want to know. Good news, we're going to find out together. I think ground type Pokemon are cool because although it's not the single best type or probably even a top 3 type, ground type Pokemon are consistently good. So I feel like there's some real classics on this list here. Normally I start these videos telling you how hard the list was to make, but this one was actually pretty easy. There were only about 10 ground types that I was even considering for this list, and they range from pretty good in a niche context to some of the best Pokemon of all time. So it was actually pretty easy to put together. We'll start at the bottom of the list and work our way up to number 1. So the Pokemon will get better as the list progresses. Also, I know what you're thinking, and it's probably that my hair is really stupid, but I was up late working on the Worlds video, and then I showered late, and then I went to bed because I was really tired, and now it looks like this, okay? And were there solutions to this problem? Yes. But did I find them? No, so I don't want to read any comments about it. Anyway, let's talk about the number 10 best ground type Pokemon, Nidoking. Nidoking?
Nidoking. Nidoking.
Nidoking. I don't know. For viewers familiar with competitive Pokemon, you might be a little surprised to see Nidoking on this list. It's not a Pokemon that often pops off. In fact, it's a Pokemon that really doesn't see that much play in most formats. However, it does have some things going for it, and under the right conditions, it was very strong. Nidoking isn't a very powerful Pokemon, but it compensates for this by also not being very bulky. The thing is, although it's not exceptional in either dimension, it's also not very fast. But all this is okay because all of its stats are also okay. Like, none of them are terrible. It's all like middle of the pack. The reason why Nidoking is on this list is because it has some things that it does really well that are somewhat unique to it. See, ground types as a whole are really heavily geared towards being physical attackers. It's similar to fighting type Pokemon, where most of the Pokemon of that type tend to be better as physical attackers than special. Nidoking is one of the exceptions. Although it doesn't have a super high special attack stat, it's able to use its ability to make itself stronger. Sheer Force is an ability that powers up all moves that have a secondary effect, but takes away that secondary effect. This is valuable on Nidoking because almost all of the moves that it wants to use have a secondary effect, and for the most part these secondary effects are only like happening 10 to 20% of the time, so you don't really mind giving them up. Sheer Force is a really good ability because it has a weird interaction with the item Life Orb, which also gives a power boost but then causes the user to lose 10% of their health every time they hit something. What's weird about Life Orb and Sheer Force is that when you have both Life Orb and Sheer Force in the same Pokemon and you use a move that has a secondary effect, you don't take the recoil damage. For some reason, the damage that you would take from Life Orb counts as a secondary effect of the move from Sheer Force. This might be a little confusing, but basically you get double the benefit for none of the cost. Nidoking is an especially good user of Sheer Force because it has a really weirdly deep move pool. It gets moves like Flamethrower, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt. Like, I don't know why a ground and poison type Pokemon is able to use these moves, but it's able to use a ton of weird moves that don't match either of its typing. Also, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but just to say it out loud, it's really hard to get ground type attackers that are also special attackers because almost all of the good ground type Pokemon are physical. So Nidoking being able to be a source of ground type damage that's a special attacker while also having valuable coverage moves is really valuable. Poison also became much more valuable after X and Y because of the addition of fairy typing. So having a poison type to resist fairy and also to hit fairy type Pokemon for super effective damage was really valuable. All of this combined to make Nidoking a special attacking Pokemon that was able to resist key threats and hit key threats for super effective damage while also providing special damage in a way that not a lot of other Pokemon could kind of substitute for. And this resulted in it getting second place at an international championship in 2018. Nidoking also got second place at a national championship back in 2012. So it saw a little bit of longevity across formats, though this was pretty much the extent of its success. Our number 9 Pokemon has had a lot more success than Nidoking has, and at one point was even one of the dominant forces that players were using. It's Rhyperior, the evolution of Rhydon. Now, Rhyperior was used a little bit back in Black and White and X and Y. It actually got second at Nationals back in 2013 in the last year of Black 2 and White 2, and then placed fourth at a National in 2014, the following year, the first year of X and Y, but neither of these finishes are so remarkable that it would earn its place on this list on its own. The real reason Rhyperior is here is that it was one of the best Pokemon during Sword and Shield's initial few months. Rhyperior was kind of perfectly positioned to just take advantage of all the unique conditions surrounding the earlier part of Sword and Shield, and it resulted in it being an extremely threatening Pokemon. Here's what you need to know. First, Sword and Shield introduced Dynamax, which allowed a Pokemon to double its HP pool and powered up all of its individual moves. Rhyperior was a good Dynamax attacker for a couple of reasons. First, it has the ability Solid Rock, which causes all super effective damage to do less damage than it would otherwise. This is a big deal when you double your HP pool because even though Rhyperior has a couple quadruple weaknesses, it has really good natural physical defense and a decent HP stat. And so when you're tuning down super effective moves and you're doubling how much health you have, it becomes really difficult to get rid of. Rhyperior was also able to take advantage of the fact that Dynamax powered up your moves. Of course, all Pokemon benefited from their moves getting stronger, but Rhyperior was able to take advantage of it for other reasons. As a rock-type Pokemon, it wasn't able to use any moves that are 100% accurate. This is a fun fact many of you might not know, but pretty much all of the rock moves worth using can miss. There are a couple exceptions, but moves like Rock Slide, Meteor Beam, and Stone Edge are some of the most prevalent ones, and they all are inaccurate. So first of all, Rhyperior could not only get a damage boost, but it could also not miss. The other advantage though was that each Dynamax move gained a secondary effect, and both of Rhyperior's secondary effects were really valuable. The rock type 1 set up the Sandstorm, which not only overwrote your opponent's weather conditions and did a little bit of damage to your opponents every turn, but it also makes Rhyperior tankier on the special side, which is its far lower defensive stats. Max Quake also just gives both Rhyperior and its partner a special defense boost, again making them much harder to get rid of. Rhyperior is also very slow, which made it a very good Pokemon to use in Trick Room, where slow Pokemon move before fast ones. The last piece of the puzzle that I've kind of buried the lead on here though is the item that Rhyperior would hold. It's the weakness policy, and it doubles a Pokemon's attack and special attack stats after they've been hit by a super effective move. This not only has incredible synergy with Solid Rock, which again weakens opposing super effective moves, but many players would actually activate their own Rhyperior's weakness policy on their own. This not only has great synergy with Solid Rock if your opponent ever hit Rhyperior with a super effective attack, though many people would actually just activate their own weakness policy. Dusclops was the most popular partner, and it could use moves like Bulldoze or Brick Break to attack its own partner Rhyperior, doing basically 0 damage because Dusclops is so weak, but doubling Rhyperior's offensive stats. I used this combination to get second place at a regional actually back at the beginning of Sword and Shield, and it was really dangerous. It had a ton of success. All these factors combined to make Rhyperior one of the best Pokemon when Sword and Shield first released, and the fact that it had a little success outside of just Sword and Shield as well definitely convinced me that it should be on this list. I learned a fun fact recently that I thought was a little bit surprising. According to researchers at Dark Cat University, subscribing to the WolfeyVGC YouTube channel can actually make you 10 to 15% more attractive on average to strangers. Now, I was as surprised as you probably are to hear this, but I figured I would pass it along because yeah, this is really groundbreaking stuff. Researchers also found that there are other benefits to subscribing as well, such as telling YouTube that you want to see more of this content and supporting the channel as well as everybody who works on it. Anyway, if you don't like hearing about it, I'm sorry, I'm just the messenger. You can take it up with the big cat. Coming in at number 8 is a Pokemon that's actually a world champion. Mamoswine. Mamoswine not only won the world championships back in 2013, it also won multiple regional championships during Black and White. That being said, the world's victory was over 10 years ago, and Mamoswine hasn't had a ton more success since then. That's being a little bit kind about it. It really hasn't seen any usage since then. So that's the reason why, despite being a world champion, it's not higher on the list. That being said, being a world champion is a really big deal. Mamoswine was able to win worlds despite not being very popular or really even used at all in 2013 because of a combination of its typing and its stats. There were a lot of flying type Pokemon during the last year of Black and White's competitive scene, one of which was Thundurus, who was just a nightmare to play against. Thundurus was used as this incredibly disruptive support Pokemon that really focused on just paralyzing all of your Pokemon and making them unable to move. Mamoswine was kind of perfectly positioned to deal with Thundurus because not only was it a ground type Pokemon making it immune to all electric type moves, but as an ice type Pokemon, it was also able to threaten the flying types back. Thundurus, Landorus, and Tornadus were all very popular this year and they were all hit by the ice type moves, but Mamoswine's coverage was also able to hit many other meta Pokemon as well, like Heatran and Tyranitar with its ground type moves and Amoonguss with its ice type moves. Mamoswine was also fast enough that with a Choice Scarf, it would outrun most of the popular Pokemon in the format, allowing it to attack them for big damage before they could move. Again, it wasn't very popular at the time. I think the world's Mamoswine was the only one I saw all year, but it was so well positioned that it was able to win the world championships. Now, even though Mamoswine hasn't been good for a while, I do think it's worth noting that it could be good again at some point if the conditions were right again, because it received a pretty major buff, I think in Sword and Shield, though it might have been in Scarlet and Violet. Mamoswine's primary ability that it used to use was Thick Fat to reduce damage from fire and ice type moves, but recently its Oblivious ability was buffed. Oblivious was not a very useful ability before, but now it prevents a Pokemon's attack from being lowered via Intimidate. And Intimidate is very popular. It's the main way that you reduce the damage from physical attackers, so being immune to it as a physical attacker is a pretty big deal. Now, this buff didn't take Mamoswine to being, meta relevant at all, but I think that it could again in the future be good in part because of this buff. Our number 7 slot is another Pokemon that's won the world championships, Krookodile. I really like Krookodile. I think it's a funny Pokemon and its name is fun to say. Now, Krookodile is above Mamoswine because not only did it win the world championships in 2017, it actually got second at the world championships Championships in 2011 as well. On top of that, Krookodile was a great Pokemon throughout 2017 and a bit of 2018 as well, actually winning multiple regional championships. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Krookodile is like the strongest Pokemon of all time. It's really just a Pokemon that can shine when the power level is lower because there aren't stronger alternatives around. But some competitive rule sets do ban a lot of the Pokemon out, and so in those formats, Krookodile has been able to shine. Krookodile is a ground and dark type Pokemon who is primarily used with the Intimidate ability, which, as I mentioned before, is just one of the most valuable and versatile abilities in the game. Krookodile has decent stats. It's not unbelievably bulky, but it's bulky enough, especially with Intimidate, that it probably isn't going to go down to one hit. And it's not so fast, but it's fast enough that it can kind of play in this middle speed tier, and it's decently powerful. I wouldn't say that Dark is an incredibly synergistic type with Ground, but it is just nice to have a secondary type so you get a couple more resistances and you get more offensive moves. One of the reasons why Krookodile was used a little bit in 2017 or 2018 was actually because it was a really good Pokemon to pair with Eevee. Eevee was given a signature Z move, which we can't show you because it will flag copyright because it was shown in a trailer, but basically this Z move doubled all of Eevee's stats. Now, Eevee couldn't really use these stats very well, so what it would do is Baton Pass to give the stats to another Pokemon. Krookodile was a prime choice here because not only was it immune to Prankster moves because of its dark typing, but it also was able to use the move Power Trip, which is a move that starts out very weak but becomes stronger the more stat boost you have. With Eevee passing Krookodile, I think 10 stat boosts, Power Trip would KO pretty much any Pokemon in the game. Krookodile is another Pokemon where I think it can only come back when the power level is significantly lower, but it does have enough going for it that I think it wouldn't be shocking to see it perform well again in the future. That's a little different than our number 6 Pokemon, which is a Pokemon that is actively still getting results today. It's Excadrill, a ground and steel type Pokemon. Now, Excadrill's never won the World Championships, but it did place top 4 in 2012 and top 8 in 2013. It also had multiple national top 4s during the Black and White era. It got a first and a second at Nationals in 2015. It won Nationals in 2018. It was really good in 2020. And most recently, it won a regional just a couple months ago. So what makes Excadrill so good? First, Steel is just a great type to have. It's good offensively against fairy types, which can be a real problem, but it's mostly good defensively, giving the Pokemon a ton of resistances. The real reason that Excadrill is so good though has to do with its stats and its ability. Excadrill has a high attack stat, allowing it to do big damage, and it's reasonably fast, but it really becomes scary when the sand is up thanks to its ability Sand Rush. Excadrill is pretty much the only Sand Rush Pokemon that has ever been relevant. Sand Rush doubles a Pokemon's speed in the sandstorm, and doubling your speed stat is a pretty big deal. There is an ability like this for every weather condition, but whereas there's multiple good Pokemon to choose from when it comes to sun or rain, sand, you pretty much just have Excadrill, which is okay because Excadrill is really good. Because it has such a high attack stat and ground and steel have pretty decent synergy together, it's a very threatening Pokemon when you're facing down against it in the sand. It can also buff its own attack stat with Swords Dance if you ignore it. It's also nice because even though it has 2 types and Tyranitar also has 2 types, and between them they have the 3 types that are all immune to Sandstorm, there's no typing overlap between the two, which is nice because Tyranitar is far and away the best sand setter, so you're able to use 2 Pokemon and get 4 different types out of it. Even though they do overlap a lot in their weaknesses, you're still not overlapping on your typing. This is the main way that Excadrill has been used over the years, as an offensive, fast Sand Rush attacker where it often holds the Focus Sash item, which requires 2 hits to knock it out. It can come in when the sand is up and finish off low HP Pokemon, or threaten flinches with Iron Head or Rock Slide, or just big ground type damage, but it's not the only way that Excadrill has been used. Let's say you want to run Excadrill, but you don't want to use sand on your team. Well, Excadrill has another very useful ability, Mold Breaker. This allows it to ignore the abilities of other Pokemon, which mostly takes the form of ignoring Levitate, so you can hit Pokemon like Rotom with your ground attacks, but also allows you to hit Pokemon like Mimikyu, ignoring their disguise. This was one of the main sets that people ran on Excadrill during Sword and Shield, again when Dynamax was first released. And that's because Excadrill was one of the best Dynamax attackers in the game. You already know that Max Quake, the ground type max move, raises your team's special defense, but Max Steel Spike raises their physical defense. In other words, even though Excadrill is such an offensive Pokemon, it was able to boost both of its teammates' defense stats while also outputting huge damage. And even though Excadrill doesn't have phenomenal bulk, when you double its HP stat and start giving it multiple boosts in its defense stats, it becomes really difficult to get rid of. It also had incredible synergy with Togekiss, who was probably the best Pokemon when Sword and Shield first released. Togekiss was a very threatening support Pokemon who could flinch your Pokemon with Air Slash, redirect attacks with Follow Me, and even put Pokemon to sleep with Yawn. Because Togekiss was an actual flying type and not a Levitate Pokemon, it was also immune to ground type moves like Earthquake coming out of Excadrill. And it could also Dynamax itself if it wanted, using flying and fairy type max moves to do big damage and raise its team's speed. These two had incredible synergy, and they were on a lot of successful teams when the games first released. Now that Dynamax is gone though, Excadrill's back to to being a Sand Rush attacker. It most recently won a regional, even though it wasn't thought to be a top threat, when paired with Pokemon like Tyranitar, Indeedee Male, and Sneasler. It's a Pokemon that I think will always be good, unless they invent a Pokemon that's basically Urshifu but Excadrill for me, which hopefully they never do. Coming in at number 5 is a newer addition to the games, Ursaluna. There are 2 different Ursaluna forms, but I'm lumping them together here at number 5 because they have the same Pokedex number, and I think it's weird to split a Pokemon like this up. Anyway, Ursaluna is one of the strongest Pokemon to come out of Scarlet and Violet, and it has some of the best results of any Generation 9 Pokemon, which is funny because it wasn't even legal for most of the first year. Let's talk about what the different Ursalunas do. Both forms share some things in common. They're both ground and normal type Pokemon who are relatively slow and hit really hard. Regular Ursaluna uses the Guts ability, almost always when paired with the Flame Orb item, to give itself a 50% power boost and make it immune to all other status conditions. This is a big deal because Ursaluna as a normal type is able to use the move Facade, a move that starts out pretty weak but doubles in power if it's affected by a status condition. Combining the status condition, the boost from being a normal type, and the boost from Guts turns Facade into one of the single strongest attacks in the entire game.
Now that's a lot of damage!
It's even able to KO super tanky Pokemon like a Moongus in a single hit. Ursaluna also makes use of its ground typing, as it can use both Earthquake for spread damage and Headlong Rush. Headlong Rush is a newer move that is incredibly powerful, but lowers both the user's defense stats after it hits. This is effectively ground type close combat, and given that Earthquake also hits your partner, it's a really good option because it not only does immense amounts of damage, but it also gives you access to a ground type move that doesn't miss and also doesn't attack your partner. Ursaluna Blood Moon plays a bit differently. While it's also a slow damage dealing bear, its stats focus instead on it being a special attacker, which again is hard to get as a ground type. It gets a signature move called Blood Moon, which is just stupid. It's a stupid move. It's a normal type move that's pretty much as strong as Hyper Beam and never misses, and the only downside is that you can't click it 2 turns in a row. This really isn't that big of a downside because Ursaluna Blood Moon has other great moves like the always consistent Earth Power and Hyper Voice, which hits both your opponent's Pokemon. Normally, the way you'd get around a strong normal type attacker is to use Ghost type Pokemon, but Ursaluna Blood Moon has a signature ability called Mind's Eye, which not only allows it to ignore the target's evasion changes and any accuracy drops on its own end, but it also lets normal type moves hit Ghost type Pokemon. Both Ursalunas have had a ton of success, and it's cool because we've seen them used both as Trick Room attackers and as Tailwind attackers and as hybrid attackers, actually being used in both Tailwind and Trick Room on the same team. They both output tons of damage and are really hard to deal with, and for players who are really good at positioning them, can basically just win the game on their own. Because they are so strong, they've also seen success both in the highest power level formats and the lowest ones. I think that as long as Ursaluna is put into Pokemon games in the future, it will continue having results. And personally, I hope that I never have to deal with Dynamax Ursaluna Blood Moon. Okay, here's where things get really interesting on this list. There are 4 remaining Pokemon in the main portion of this list, and each of them has won the World Championships not once, but twice. Every single Pokemon remaining has exactly 2 Worlds wins, and so ranking them was a little bit tricky, but in the end, I found an order that I really like. Let's start with number 4, Gastrodon. I guess Gastrodon technically also has 2 forms, just like Ursaluna, but because they have the same stats and are only cosmetic differences, I'm not going to talk about them separately. Sorry to all the pink Gastrodon enjoyers. Anyway, in addition to being a 2-time world champion, Gastrodon is also a 3-time international champion. Gastrodon's interesting because while a lot of the ground type Pokemon on this list are offensive Pokemon that just aim to blow their opponents up with ground type damage, Gastrodon takes more of a supportive role. It's got really respectable natural bulk, allowing it to stick around, especially with a defensive item. But the main draw of Gastrodon and the reason why it's a 2-time world champion has to do with its ability. Storm Drain is a really powerful ability. It not only makes the user immune to all water type attacks, but it also draws them in, acting as a pseudo redirection for any single target water attack. This means that if Urshifu Water tries to attack Gastrodon's partner, it'll be redirected into Gastrodon, do no damage, and give Gastrodon a special attack boost. For this reason, Gastrodon really shines when there are powerful water type Pokemon who are dominating the format. But Gastrodon still has some use even when the opponent isn't using water type attackers. Ground is such a solid offensive type that Gastrodon's able to put consistent damage out with Earth Power turn after turn, especially since it's so hard to get rid of it. It's not a Pokemon that you're often relying on for one-hit KOs, but it is a Pokemon where it can gradually chip your opponent down over time. It also learns the move Ice Beam, which has really good synergy with ground since it hits the grass and flying type Pokemon that ground isn't able to hit. Ignoring Gastrodon can also be dangerous for other reasons as well. During Dynamax, one of the best disruptive moves was Yawn, which causes a Pokemon to fall asleep unless they switch out. Switching out your Pokemon can range from being not a big deal at all to not even possible, but in Dynamax, you you really didn't want to switch. You couldn't get rid of Dynamax with pretty much anything. Moves like Roar and Whirlwind didn't work, and there was really only one very cheesy strategy that you could use to force your opponent to give up their Dynamax. But if you hit a Dynamax Pokemon with Yawn, they'd be forced to either stay in and fall asleep the next turn, wasting their Dynamax turns, or switch out and finish their Dynamax turns and not be able to get full value out of it. Because Gastrodon was so tanky and it has 2 different immunities, it was one of the best Yawn Pokemon during the Dynamax era, and that's part of the reason it was able to win Worlds. It was also really good during the final year of Sword and Shield because Kyogre was a very popular Pokemon, and Dynamax Kyogre could only use single target water attacks. Basically, if you had Gastrodon on your team and your opponent Dynamaxed their Kyogre, they wouldn't be able to use their strongest moves. Ground and Water also have decent coverage because Water is only weak to Grass and Electric, and Ground type Pokemon are immune to Electric type attacks. Ground is also weak to Ice and Water, both of which Water resists. This results in a type combination that only has one weakness to Grass, though it is a quadruple weakness. Although Gastrodon doesn't have the best stats, its ability and its move pool and its typing and its coverage all combine to make it a very threatening Pokemon, and I'm not shocked at all that it won Worlds twice, and I think it's a Pokemon that can always pop up, especially when there are strong water type Pokemon around. Okay, before we talk about the top 3, let's talk about some honorable mentions. These will be quick. Number 1, Ting-Lu. This is the Pokemon that I was the closest to putting on this list. It was really good during Regulation C of Scarlet and Violet. I think if it has good performances in future years, I could definitely put it on here, but it really was only good for one format so far within Scarlet and Violet, and after like the real Pokemon became legal, like Urshifu and Incineroar and like all these other really powerful Pokemon came back, Ting-Lu just hasn't had any results. I think it definitely could make it on here in the future, but for now, not present. I wanted to mention Rhydon here. Actually, Rhydon's best performance at the World Championships is better than Rhyperior's. It made it all the way to the semifinals in 2013. This is because Rhydon actually has a decently high attack stat, and with the Eviolite item, it's very bulky. And that year in particular, like I said, Thundurus was incredibly dominant and was paralyzing everything, and Rhydon could use the Lightning Rod ability, which is the electric type version of Storm Drain, to make its partner Pokemon immune to all electric type moves, and that was really valuable that year. Another honorable mention is Zygarde. Zygarde is a restricted Pokemon, which is definitely interesting. It's only legal during a couple rule sets every couple of years, and it's definitely not super dominant, especially because it's not that powerful, but it is really tanky, especially in its complete form. It's really hard to get rid of. It saw a bit of success. It was used with like Coil sometimes to set up its attack and defense stats, and sometimes you'd use it like Tapu Fini next to it, and you'd activate the Misty Steed to make it really bulky. It was annoying to get rid of. It was definitely strong, but I didn't think it deserved its place on this list. Nidoqueen, I actually initially had over Nidoking on this list before I checked the results. It has a couple results. It's similar to Nidoking, except it's a little weaker, a little slower, and a bit bulkier. So just a different trade-off. It's basically just an alternate skin of Nidoking. And then lastly for the honorable mentions is Marowak. Marowak also was used in the top 8 of the 2013 World Championships. Similar to Rhydon, it's a Lightning Rod user that again makes its partners immune to electric type moves, which was very valuable back then. And it hits a bit harder than Rhydon because it can hold the Thick Club item, which doubles its attack stat. That being said, it hasn't really seen a lot of success outside of its Alolan form, and its Alolan form is a fire type and ghost type, so it's not relevant here. Okay, now all that we have left is the top 3 best ground type Pokemon. Number 3 will shock you, I have a feeling, because number 3 is Garchomp. Now, Garchomp is an incredible Pokemon. I don't think anyone's surprised that Garchomp is on this list. The real question, though, is why is Garchomp not higher? And that's because the Pokemon above it are really, really good. Garchomp is also a 2-time world champion and a 6-time national and international champion. It's pretty clear that it is the strongest non-legendary ground type Pokemon. I guess spoilers for what comes next. Garchomp is fast, strong, and relatively bulky with good typing and multiple good abilities to choose from. Early on in VGC's history, it was often paired with Tyranitar because of how good Sandveil is. Sandveil giving all moves a chance to miss when the sand is up. Back in Black and White, sand never ended. It was just permanent weather unless your opponent overrode it somehow. And Garchomp has good enough natural bulk that it often took 2 or 3 different hits to get rid of it. And every time you attacked Garchomp, you had a chance to miss. Given that Garchomp is so strong and so fast and so good at putting out damage, missing 2 or oftentimes even 1 move against it could cause you to fall too far behind to recover. Nowadays, though, Garchomp tends to use the Rough Skin ability more often because it often works as a standalone Pokemon rather than one paired with Tyranitar. Rough Skin isn't as insane as Sandveil is, but it is more consistent because it always activates when the effect triggers rather than Sandveil, which only activates, 20% of the time. And also it's really good at breaking focus sashes, and if you don't have sand on your team, then you don't really want Sandveil anyway. The main thing that makes Garchomp so strong is how fast it is and how strong it is. It definitely doesn't have the same stats as some of the, new power crept Pokemon, but it is really good and really consistent, and it's faster and stronger than a lot of Pokemon that tend to be used within a format. The real number you want to be above often is base 100. That's like where a lot of Pokemon tend to fall, and most formats prior to Scarlet and Violet like back in the day. And with this speed stack, Garchomp was great at just outputting consistent damage. Dragon also has good synergy with ground offensively, because for a while, the only type that resisted dragon type moves was steel, and steel type Pokemon are weak to ground. Now we have fairy type Pokemon who are immune to dragon moves, but ground is at least still neutral against them, so it's not awful. Garchomp's main weakness is its quadruple weakness to ice, and the fact that it has stats that were really broken for a 4th gen Pokemon, not a 9th gen Pokemon, but overall it's able to work around these weaknesses somewhat well. It is a Pokemon that has struggled a lot in recent years. Power creep has not been kind to Garchomp, and it has trouble keeping up with some of the most broken Pokemon that they're releasing nowadays. That being said, Garchomp just had a major resurgence because in the rule set following last year's World Championships, called Regulation H, all legendary Pokemon were banned, and all Paradox Pokemon to boot. With many of its main threats removed, Garchomp had an incredible string of performances, winning multiple regionals, getting second at multiple regionals, and being overall one of the staples of the format. It was able to take advantage of one of the newer tools added to the games, the Clear Amulet, which prevented its attack stat from being lowered, primarily via Intimidate. I do think that power creep has not been kind to Garchomp, and when all of the Pokemon are available, it's a Pokemon that probably can't keep up, which is part of the reason why it's not higher up on this list. The Pokemon above it absolutely can still keep up, but I do think that in formats where the power level is lower, we'll definitely be seeing more of Garchomp. Okay, top 2, and they're both legendary Pokemon. My guess is that some of you probably expect that the number 2 Pokemon, Landorus, was going to be the number 1, but it's not. Just like Ursaluna, Landorus has 2 forms, and I'll talk about both of them here. Actually, also similar to Ursaluna, they both share typing, and one is a physical attacker, one is a special attacker. The most infamous one, of course, is Landorus Therian, who for a while was thought to be the best Pokemon of all time. In addition to winning Worlds twice, Landorus Therian also got second at Worlds twice, and has won 6 national and international championships. Landorus Therian has a ridiculously high attack stat, in addition to good natural bulk and a respectable speed tier. It feels even bulkier than it actually is, because it gets access to Intimidate, which again is one of the most versatile and generally useful abilities in the entire competitive game. It's also one of the best Intimidate users because of its stupidly deep move pool, which I really don't understand. Landorus gets great coverage moves like Superpower and Knockoff, but it also gets U-Turn, which causes it to not only do damage, but also switch out. U-Turn is an incredible staple of its move pool because it allows Landorus to switch out while also doing damage and scouting for what the opponent wants to do, and this allows it to get off the field while still doing damage, which then in turn allows it to reactivate Intimidate later on in the battle. U-Turn's also decent as a coverage move because although Bug isn't a very strong offensive type, one of the main Pokemon that countered Landorus for a while, or was supposed to counter Landorus, was Cresselia, who's a super tanky Pokemon that's immune to ground type moves and can learn ice type moves, which Landorus is weak to. That being said, Landorus could do good chip damage to Cresselia with U-Turn while also keeping itself safe thanks to its higher speed stat, making it much harder to pin the tiger down. Ground and Flying also have really good offensive synergy together, since ground type Pokemon are unable to hit grass and bug type Pokemon for neutral damage, both of which are weak to flying, and flying's not very effective against steel, rock, and electric type Pokemon, all of whom are weak to ground. Of course, this is less of a big deal because Landorus doesn't learn really any good flying type attacks, but that's not so much of an issue because it's able to use flying type moves with Z-Max and then Dynamax and now Terrestrialization. Landorus Incarnate was certainly never as dominant as Landorus Therian, but it was still very powerful, and it actually got second at the World Championships last year. It also has 2 national wins and a handful of regional wins. Landorus Incarnate, I think, is the best ground type special attacker of all time. This is because, similar to Nidoking, it gets the ability Sheer Force. With Sheer Force, Life Orb, and its much higher special attack stat, Landorus Incarnate can output tons of ground type damage that can't be slowed down by Intimidate. It was certainly never as dominant as Landorus Therian, but it was still a good Pokemon in its own right, and it actually had a ton of good performances last year alone. I actually think that last year it probably outperformed Landorus Therian on the whole. Landorus and Landorus are certainly 2 of the best ground type Pokemon of all time. But the best ground type Pokemon of all time is Groudon. Groudon is a 2-time world champion, placed second at Worlds twice, and has 8 national and international wins. He's the Dawn. But what you have to understand about Groudon is that although it has pretty much as good or better results as any other Pokemon on this list, it's only legal for a fraction of the time. Groudon is a restricted Pokemon, and restricted Pokemon are only legal during very specific rule sets. I started playing competitively in 2011. The first year that Groudon was legal after I started playing was 2016. For contrast, Landorus was legal every single one of those years that Groudon wasn't, and Groudon still has better results. Now, Groudon also technically has 2 forms. It has its regular form and its primal form, which was similar to Mega Evolution but more broken. if you can believe that. Primal Groudon was insane. It gained the fire typing, which caused it to only have 2 weaknesses to ground and a quadruple weakness to water, but its ability, Desolate Land, turned the sunlight to Primordial Sunlight, which caused all water moves to evaporate and do 0 damage. So effectively, if the Primordial Sun was up, Primal Groudon only had 1 weakness. Primal Groudon has some of the best stats of any restricted Pokemon ever. It is ridiculously tanky, it hits super hard, and it even has the option of being a special attacker because it has a respectable special attack stat. It has a signature move called Precipice Blades, which is kind of Earthquake for gamblers. It's higher risk, higher reward. It can miss unlike Earthquake, but it's much stronger and it doesn't hit your partner. Primal Groudon also has ridiculous synergy with Xerneas, who at the time was the single most threatening restricted Pokemon. As a fairy type attacker, Xerneas' moves were only resisted by fire, poison, and steel type Pokemon, all of whom are weak to Groudon. Every single one of them. Steel's actually weak to both of Primal Groudon's types. Primal Groudon and Xerneas were the most threatening restricted duo in all of the years that they were legal, and they won the majority of tournaments, by far the most out of any restricted pairing. But regular Groudon is no slouch. It won the World Championships in 2010 and got second at the World Championships in 2022 as well. Groudon was probably the second best restricted Pokemon behind Zacian during Sword and Shield because it not only worked as a Dynamax attacker, becoming incredibly tanky, resetting its own weather if it went down with fire moves, and making its team more specially bulky with Max Quake, but it also enabled Gigantamax Charizard, who was probably the most threatening Dynamax attacker. Gigantamax Charizard was able to do unholy amounts of damage, often picking up one-hit KOs even on Dynamax Pokemon, but it was only able to do this if the strong sunlight was up. The combination of regular Groudon and Gigantamax Charizard dominated for most of Sword and Shield during the year that it was legal, and it only just barely didn't win the World Championships. Now, it is worth noting that Groudon was legal during Scarlet and Violet's first restricted format, where you were only allowed to use one restricted Pokemon, and it didn't really have many good results. It was used as like a niche option here and there, and it certainly was threatening, like it was a Pokemon that players were aware of, but it was not in the top 7 best restricted Pokemon. I think this is in part due to power creep. I think this is in part due to the fact that it doesn't currently have access to its primal form. And I think it's because there's another restricted Pokemon that can set the sun up, which is much faster than Groudon. That being said, I would never count Groudon out, and I'm sure that it will certainly have a resurgence at some point in the future, especially if it ever gets its primal form back. And those are the 10 best ground type Pokemon. I actually did another of these videos recently where I talked about the best ice type Pokemon. So if you enjoyed this one, you should check it out. Thanks for watching.